He was not meant for the history books. For the first 40 years of his life, Oliver Cromwell was an utterly obscure man, a shadow against the backdrop of his era's turbulent events. He was born in 1599 to a family of minor gentry. His lineage was once wealthy and influential. His great-great-grandfather had been a close associate of King Henry VIII and made a fortune from the dissolution of the monasteries. But by the time of Oliver's birth, only memories of that former greatness remained. He was, in essence, a well-to-do farmer, a gentleman from the provincial backwoods. His world was confined to the fields of Huntingdon, the local church, and family concerns. Nothing, absolutely nothing, in his early life foretold the future regicide and dictator. He received a standard education for his class, attending a local school and then spending a year at Cambridge. He was not a brilliant student. He was more interested in sports, wrestling, swimming, and horseback riding than in Latin and theology. He was a sturdy, physically strong young man with a stern, somewhat coarse face, reportedly marked by a large wart. He was hot-tempered, prone to bouts of melancholy, and, like many of his time, deeply, almost fanatically religious. He was a Puritan. Puritanism was more than just a religious movement. It was a worldview. Puritans, followers of John Calvin's teachings, believed in divine predestination. They held that God had chosen some people for salvation and others for eternal damnation, although no one could know for certain which category they belonged to, were expected to prove their status through their entire lives. Diligent work, strict morals, modesty, and constant prayer and Bible reading. They detested the splendor of the official Anglican Church, its hierarchy of bishops, and its rituals, which they believed were borrowed from Catholicism. They wanted the Church to make it simple and austere, based solely on the Word of God. For Cromwell, this faith was not just a set of rules, it was the essence of his life. He sincerely believed that his every step and every action were seen by God, and that he, Oliver Cromwell, was an instrument in the hands of Providence. After his father's death, he was forced to drop out of his studies and return home to manage the modest estate and care for his mother and sisters. He married and had children. He led the life of a typical country squire, farming, participating in local affairs, and administering minor justice. Around the age of 30, he experienced a profound spiritual crisis, a rebirth, as he called it. He was on the verge of despair, tormented by thoughts of his sins and his potential damnation. But after this crisis, his faith became even stronger, almost unshakable. He became one of the most respected Puritans in his county. In 1628, he was first elected to Parliament. He was an inconspicuous member for Huntingdon, delivering only one, albeit fiery, speech in defense of persecuted Puritan preachers. But soon, King Charles I, facing an insubordinate Parliament, dissolved it and began his 11-year personal rule. For Cromwell, as for many others, this was a period of despair. He even considered emigrating to America, to New England, where Puritans were trying to build their kingdom of God on earth. But he stayed. He continued to live his quiet, unremarkable life, managing his estate and praying. It seemed that history would pass him by. But history was preparing to strike. King Charles I was a man who seemed born to lose his throne. He was stubborn, arrogant, and, like his father, a firm believer in the divine right of kings. He believed his power was granted by God, and he was accountable to no one, least of all Parliament. He imposed new taxes without Parliament's consent, and persecuted Puritans, trying to force a single Anglican rite, similar to Catholicism, upon the entire country. He ruled as an absolute monarch, and the chasm between him and his people, especially the Puritan segment, grew ever wider. Stories of how obscure, humble individuals emerge from the shadows at pivotal moments in history to change the world are the most inspiring. They show that greatness is not always a matter of birth or an early start, but often a question of character and faith confronting a great challenge. Our channel is dedicated to such complex, ambiguous figures, whose deeds evoke both admiration and horror. To ensure you don't miss our next deep dives into the most dramatic biographies, make sure you're subscribed. And now, let's return to England, where the breaking point had been reached. The spark that ignited the flame came from Scotland. When Charles tried to impose the Anglican prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots, they rebelled. This marked the beginning of the so-called Bishops' Wars. To raise money for the war against the Scots, Charles, after an 11-year hiatus, was forced to summon Parliament once again in 1640. Among the members who gathered in London was the 41-year-old Oliver Cromwell, now representing Cambridge. He was no longer the timid newcomer of a decade earlier. He was a mature man, firmly established, with a reputation as an honest and godly individual, a defender of the common people. One member of Parliament described his first impression of Cromwell thus: "I saw a gentleman very ordinarily apparelled. His countenance was swollen and reddish, his voice sharp and untunable, and his eloquence full of fervor. But I lived to see this gentleman rise to a high pitch." The new Parliament, known to history as the Long Parliament, had no intention of giving the king money. Instead, it began to present its own demands: punish the king's hated ministers, abolish illegal taxes, and guarantee that Parliament would be summoned regularly. The confrontation between the king and Parliament intensified. Cromwell, though not yet a leader, became one of the most active and radical members of the opposition. He spoke infrequently, but his speeches, devoid of any elegance, were filled with biblical fury and righteous anger. He saw the political struggle not merely as a dispute over taxes and power, but as a great spiritual battle between the forces of godliness, represented by the God-fearing Parliament, and the forces of tyranny, embodied by the king and his court. The confrontation came to a head in January 1642. Charles, determined to crush the opposition in a single blow, personally entered the House of Commons with a detachment of soldiers to arrest 5 of its leaders. But they had been warned and managed to escape. This act of unprecedented violence, the king's armed intrusion into the sacred halls of Parliament, was the final straw. London rose up in revolt. The king was forced to flee the capital for the north. Both sides began to raise armies. In August 1642, King Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham. The English Civil War had begun, and Oliver Cromwell, a 43-year-old farmer who had never spent a day in military service, returned to his native Cambridgeshire to raise a troop of cavalry for the Parliamentarian army, funded by his own money and that of his supporters. The obscure man had stepped out of the shadows, and very soon he would show all of England how a true soldier of God should fight and win. When the war began, the Parliamentarian army was a pitiful sight. It consisted of hastily assembled local militias, city train bands, and mercenaries commanded by aristocrats like the Earl of Essex or the Earl of Manchester. These men were brave, but they were amateurs. They fought like gentlemen, avoiding decisive battles and sending their soldiers home after each campaign. Their opponents, the Cavaliers of the king's army, were similar, but had one crucial advantage: a brilliant cavalry of high-born nobles who had been trained in swordsmanship and horsemanship from childhood. This cavalry was led by the king's charismatic and daring nephew, Prince Rupert. In the early battles of the war, such as the Battle of Edgehill, the outcome was always the same. The Parliamentarian infantry held firm, but its cavalry was routed by the furious charge of the Cavaliers, who would then lose all discipline in pursuit and plunder, squandering the chance for a decisive victory. Oliver Cromwell, who at the start of the war was merely a captain of a small cavalry troop of 60 men, watched this with growing anger and frustration. With his pragmatic farmer's mind, he immediately saw the root of the problem. He was not a strategist. He was a genius of organization and psychology. After the Battle of Edgehill, he spoke words to his cousin, the parliamentarian leader John Hampden, that would become the key to his future victories. Cromwell understood that to counter the aristocratic honor of the Cavaliers, something more than a mercenary's pay was needed. An idea was needed. Faith was needed. "You must get men of a spirit," he continued, "that is likely to go on as far as gentlemen will go, or you will be beaten still." He decided to create a new type of army, one whose main strength would be not birth, but ideology. An army that would fight not for money or for lords, but for God and the just cause of Parliament. He returned to East Anglia, a Puritan heartland, and began to recruit his soldiers. He did not take just anyone. He selected men personally, paying attention not to their social status, but to their character and, most importantly, their religious zeal. He recruited yeomen, freeholding farmers, artisans, and small merchants. These were sober, hard-working, God-fearing men who could read so they could study the Bible themselves, and who went to war not for adventure, but out of deep conviction. He told them, "I will not cozen you by perplexed expressions in my commission about fighting for king and parliament. If the king chanced to be in the body of the enemy, I would as soon discharge my pistol upon him as upon any other private person." He established iron discipline for his soldiers, but this discipline was based not on the fear of flogging, but on a shared ideal. His camp was more like a religious community than a gathering of mercenaries. Drunkenness, gambling, and profanity were punished mercilessly. Each day began and ended with common prayer and the singing of psalms. They prayed before every battle. Yet Cromwell was surprisingly tolerant for his time. He did not care which Protestant sect a soldier belonged to, whether he was a Presbyterian, a Baptist, or an independent like himself. The main thing was faith in God and hatred of popery and tyranny. "The state, in choosing men to serve it," he said, "takes no notice of their opinions. If they be willing faithfully to serve it, that satisfies." He not only prayed with his soldiers, but he also turned them into the most effective cavalrymen in Europe. He armed them with heavy broadswords, clad them in simple but sturdy cuirasses, which later earned them the nickname Ironsides, and trained them in new tactics. Unlike Prince Rupert's cavalry, which scattered to plunder after the first charge, Cromwell drilled one main rule into his men: after impact, immediately regroup, reform, and deliver another blow to the enemy's weak point. His cavalry was not a pack of wolves, but a battering ram that struck a single point, broke through the defense, returned, and struck again. Very soon, this new army, forged from faith and discipline, showed what it was capable of. Cromwell's troop, which quickly grew into a full regiment, began to win victory after victory in minor skirmishes in East Anglia. His knew no defeat. They fought with the fury of Old Testament warriors, charging into battle while singing psalms. Their battle cry was, "Rumors of this strange, invincible colonel and his soldiers spread throughout England." The finest hour for Cromwell and his Ironsides came on July 2, 1644, at the Battle of Marston Moor in Yorkshire. It was the largest and bloodiest battle of the entire war. The combined army of Parliament and their Scottish allies, numbering about 28,000 men, faced an 18,000-strong royalist army under the command of Prince Rupert. Cromwell, now a lieutenant general, commanded the cavalry on the left wing of the Parliamentarian army. The battle began in the evening after a long day of waiting, accompanied by an approaching thunderstorm. As usual, Prince Rupert attacked first. His cavaliers, with their famous furious charge, crashed into the right wing of the Parliamentarian army. Lord Fairfax's cavalry was shattered and put to flight. In the center, the Royalist infantry also began to push back the Parliamentarian regiments. It seemed the battle was lost. The right wing and center of the Parliamentarian army were broken and fleeing in panic. The Parliamentarian commanders, Lords Fairfax, Leven, and Manchester, left the field, convinced of a total defeat. But on the left wing, something different was happening. There stood Cromwell with his Ironsides. He met the charge of the opposing Royalist cavalry, and, after a fierce struggle, overthrew it. Cromwell himself was slightly wounded in the neck, but did not leave the ranks. And here he did what Prince Rupert never did. Instead of getting carried away in pursuit of the defeated enemy, he immediately halted his men, reformed them, and, assessing the situation on the battlefield, executed a brilliant maneuver. He wheeled his entire cavalry around and, crossing the battlefield, struck the rear of Prince Rupert's victorious cavalry, which by then had scattered to plunder the Parliamentarian baggage train. It was a shock. Rupert's cavaliers, attacked from an unexpected direction, were caught completely by surprise and utterly routed. Cromwell was now master of the field. He reformed his cavalry once more and fell upon the rear and flank of the Royalist infantry, which was still pressing the remaining Parliamentarian forces in the center. Caught in a vice between their own infantry and Cromwell's Ironsides, the king's army was doomed. The battle turned into a slaughter that continued late into the night. By morning, the entire Royalist army in the north of England had ceased to exist. Prince Rupert, returning to the field, asked a prisoner in amazement who had shattered his cavalry, and he heard a new, fearsome nickname. "It was Ironside," the prisoner replied, referring to Cromwell himself. The name, given to him by Rupert as a mark of respect for his unbreakable fortitude, stuck to him and his soldiers forever. Marston Moor was the turning point of the war. The north of England was lost to the king, and the whole country learned that Parliament had a new, true leader. Not an aristocrat, not a courtier, but a stern, God-fearing farmer from Huntington, who knew how to win as well as how to pray. But Cromwell did not revel in glory. He was furious. He saw that the victory at Marston Moor had not been fully exploited. His immediate superior, the Earl of Manchester, commander of the Eastern Association Army, acted indecisively, allowing King Charles to raise a new army. Cromwell realized that as long as Parliament's armies were led by aristocrats who, deep down, did not want a complete victory over King, the war would last forever. He said, he returned to London and, speaking in Parliament, delivered a crushing blow to the old command. He accused the Earl of Manchester of treason and indecision. He thundered. He demanded a complete reorganization of the army. He proposed the law that prohibited members of Parliament from holding command posts in the army. It was a clever move. It removed all the amateur aristocrats, like Essex and Manchester, from command. As an MP himself, he too should have stepped down. But his supporters ensured that an exception was made for him as an specialist. Then he achieved his main goal. Parliament passed a resolution to create the new model army. This was England's first regular professional army, maintained on a permanent salary. It was organized on the same principles Cromwell had used for his Ironsides. Soldiers and officers were appointed based on ability, not nobility, and the entire army was imbued with a spirit of Puritan piety. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed commander-in-chief, but everyone understood who the real soul of this army was. Oliver Cromwell was appointed lieutenant general and commander of all cavalry. Now he had in his hands the instrument he himself had forged, a perfect, invincible war machine of faith and iron. And with this army, he intended not just to defeat the king, he intended to build a new, godly world on the ruins of the old. The creation of the new model army marked the end of Old England. It was not just a military reform, it was a social and ideological revolution. For the first time in the country's history, an army was created based not on feudal loyalty or mercenary service, but on ideology and meritocracy. Officer positions were filled not by high-born lords, but by talented commoners, cobblers, tinkers, and brewers. One of Cromwell's best cavalry colonels was a former drayman named John Pride. This was unheard of and scandalous for aristocratic England, but it was precisely what made the army invincible. Soldiers and officers were bound not only by discipline, but by a common cause and a shared faith. They were the people of God in arms. Their baptism by fire took place on June 14, 1645, at the Battle of Naseby. This was the decisive battle of the First English Civil War. King Charles, at the head of his last major army, faced the new model army under Fairfax and Cromwell. The battle plan was almost a mirror image of Marston Moor. Prince Rupert, commanding the royalist right wing, once again swept away the opposing parliamentarian left-wing cavalry with his famous charge. And once again, he made his fatal mistake. Intoxicated by success, he got carried away with the pursuit and rushed to plunder the enemy's baggage train, taking himself out of the battle for a crucial period. Meanwhile, on the other flank, the right, Oliver Cromwell led his Ironsides against the royalist cavalry commanded by Sir Marmaduke Langdale. The Ironsides charged like an avalanche, singing psalms. After a fierce clash, they overthrew and routed the enemy cavalry. And Cromwell, just as at Marston Moor, immediately displayed his brilliant tactical discipline. He left only a small detachment to pursue the broken enemy, while he gathered his main forces into an iron fist, wheeled them around, and struck the flank and rear of the royalist infantry, which had been successfully pushing back the new model army's infantry in the center. This was the end. The royalist infantry, attacked from three sides, was surrounded and almost completely destroyed or captured. When Prince Rupert finally returned to the battlefield from his plundering raid, he saw only a scene of total devastation. King Charles, seeing the catastrophe, wanted to personally lead his last guard in a suicidal charge. But one of his lords seized his horse's bridle and led him from the field, exclaiming, "The Battle of Naseby was not just a defeat, it was a death sentence for the royalist cause." The king's army ceased to exist. But even more importantly, Parliament captured Charles's personal baggage train with his secret correspondence. These letters were immediately published. All of England learned with horror that their king, while negotiating with Parliament, was secretly seeking aid from Catholic powers in Europe, and even trying to hire Irish Catholics, the very people Protestants considered savages and murderers, to fight against his own people. In the eyes of many, even moderates, he transformed from a misguided monarch into a treacherous traitor. After Naseby, the war became a mopping-up operation. The new model army methodically, like a steamroller, crushed the last pockets of resistance. In 1646, King Charles, realizing all was lost, fled and surrendered not to Parliament, but to their Scottish allies, hoping to play on the divisions between them. The First Civil War was over. Parliament had won. But now it faced a new, even more difficult question: what to do with the victory? And what to do with the king? It was at this moment that the unity of the victors collapsed. Parliament, where the majority were Presbyterians, moderate Puritans, wanted to disband the army as quickly as possible, frightened by its radicalism and commoner makeup. They wanted to negotiate with the king, restore him to the throne with limited powers, and establish a Presbyterian church in England on the Scottish model, with a rigid hierarchy and intolerance for other faiths. But the army thought differently. The soldiers and officers who had shed their blood were not going to go home without receiving their back pay, which was months in arrears, or, more importantly, guarantees of freedom of conscience. The army was composed mainly of independents, radical Puritans who, like Cromwell, believed that each religious congregation should be independent, and that the state had no right to impose a faith on people. Even more radical ideas flourished in the army. The Levelers demanded universal male suffrage and the proclamation of a republic. The army was transforming from an instrument of Parliament into an independent, formidable political force. It was the only organized and armed power in the country, and it knew it. Cromwell found himself between a rock and a hard place. He was both a member of Parliament and the second-in-command of the army. He tried to act as a mediator, calling for moderation and compromise. But when Parliament, in its arrogance, not only refused to pay the army, but also declared its soldiers, Cromwell made his choice. He realized that the Parliament they had fought for had betrayed them. He secretly left London and joined the army, decisively taking its side. The army responded to Parliament's actions decisively. A troop of cavalry seized the king, who was under the guard of parliamentary commissioners, and brought him to the army's headquarters. Now the main bargaining chip, the king's person, was in their hands. Then the entire new model army marched on London. Meeting no resistance, it entered the capital and essentially carried out a military coup. Cromwell and the army generals expelled their main Presbyterian opponents from Parliament. All that remained of the once mighty Long Parliament was a pathetic rump, obedient to the army's will. Now Cromwell and the army command began their own negotiations with Charles. They offered him surprisingly lenient terms. They were willing to restore him to the throne and preserve the House of Lords. But they demanded regular parliaments and, most importantly, guarantees of religious toleration. This was their key ideal. But Charles, even as a prisoner, could not accept defeat. He was a master of duplicity. While pretending to negotiate with the army, he was weaving new conspiracies. He entered into a secret agreement with the Scots, promising to establish Presbyterianism in England in exchange for military aid. At the end of 1647, he escaped from custody to the Isle of Wight, from where he gave the signal for a new uprising. The start of the Second Civil War in 1648 was a moment of terrible realization for Cromwell and his comrades. They had tried to negotiate with Charles. They had offered him peace. In response, he had plunged the country back into bloodshed. For these deeply religious men, this was not just a political betrayal. It was a sign from God. They saw Charles not as a misguided monarch, but as a tyrant who bore the guilt for all the blood that had been shed, and with whom, according to the laws of the Old Testament, there could be no compromise. Their patience had run out. The war was short but brutal. While Fairfax suppressed royalist uprisings in the south of England, Cromwell marched north to meet the invading Scottish army. At the Battle of Preston, despite being outnumbered 2-1, he completely destroyed the Scottish army over 3 days, displaying tactical and strategic genius. The Second Civil War was won, and the army returned to London filled with a cold, sacred fury. It no longer wanted negotiations. It wanted a trial. But Parliament, even its still, hesitated. The members were afraid to take the final, most terrible step, and so the army took matters into its own hands. On December 6, 1648, a regiment under the command of that same Colonel Pride surrounded the Parliament building and forcibly expelled all members who were inclined to compromise with the king. This event became known as All That Remained of Parliament, was about 60 radical members, completely obedient to the army. This pathetic remnant created a special High Court of Justice to try King Charles I Stuart, God's anointed, on charges of tyranny, treason, and the murder of his subjects. This was unheard of. Never before in history had subjects put their king on trial. Charles himself, when brought into the courtroom, behaved with immense dignity. He refused to answer questions, stating that no earthly court had jurisdiction over him, for his authority came from God. But the trial proceeded. Cromwell, who may have hesitated at first, was now the main driving force behind it. He was convinced it was God's will. He pressured the judges, threatening them to force them to sign the death warrant. On January 30th, 1649, on a cold winter morning, on a scaffold erected outside the Palace of Whitehall, King Charles I of England was beheaded. Before his death, he gave a speech in which he forgave his enemies and put on 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold, lest the crowd think he was afraid. When the executioner held up his severed head, a single long groan rose from the thousands in the square, a groan of horror, shock, and perhaps remorse. Cromwell was there. Legend has it that he went to see the king's body that night. He looked at the dead face for a long time and said, "Cruel necessity." He was not a bloodthirsty maniac. He likely believed to the very end that he was carrying out God's will and saving England. But by crossing this line, by executing God's anointed, he and his followers burned all their bridges. There was no turning back. They had destroyed the old world, and now, on its ruins, they had to build a new one. And the burden of this construction, as it turned out, would fall on the shoulders of one man, Oliver Cromwell, the humble farmer who, against his own wishes, had become the most powerful and most hated man in England. The execution of the king did not bring peace to England. It plunged the nation into shock and opened a Pandora's box. Monarchical Europe was horrified by this unprecedented act of regicide. The English Republic, or Commonwealth as it was now called, became a pariah state. But the main threats came not from abroad, but from within the fractured kingdom. In Scotland, the executed monarch's son, the young Charles II, was immediately proclaimed king. And in Ireland, which was already a seething cauldron of hatred for the English Protestant colonizers, a powerful rebellion erupted. Irish Catholics, uniting with local royalists, formed an army and effectively broke away from London's control. For the newborn republic, Ireland was a dagger pointed at its throat. It could become a staging ground for an invasion by Charles II and his European allies. Parliament decided to act. It resolved to send its best and most ruthless general. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell landed in Dublin at the head of a 12,000-strong expeditionary force. He went to Ireland not merely as a general suppressing a rebellion. In his own mind, he was the sword of the Lord, a new Joshua sent to punish sinners and idolaters. To him, as to most English Protestants of the time, Irish Catholics were not just enemies. They were savages, almost subhuman. The horrific and greatly exaggerated by propaganda stories of the 1641 massacre of Protestant settlers in Ireland were fresh in his memory, as they were in the memory of all of England. He went there not to negotiate, but to exact revenge. His first strike was the siege of the town of Drogheda. The garrison, consisting of 3,000 elite soldiers, mostly English royalists, refused to surrender. Cromwell, following the brutal laws of war of that era, ordered an assault. After several fierce attacks, his Ironsides broke into the town, and then all hell broke loose. Cromwell gave the order to take no prisoners. The garrison soldiers were slaughtered. Those who sought refuge in churches were burned alive. All Catholic priests were killed. On Cromwell's orders, his soldiers carried out a massacre that did not spare some of the civilian population. In his official report to Parliament, he wrote of it with a cold, almost religious satisfaction. "I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are the satisfactory grounds to such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret." He sincerely believed that cruelty was a form of mercy, that by making a terrifying example, he would intimidate the rest into surrendering without a fight, thereby saving lives. From Drogheda, he marched on Wexford. There, the story repeated itself, but on an even more horrific scale. During negotiations for the town's surrender, his soldiers, whether by mistake or intentionally, burst into the streets and unleashed an even more monstrous slaughter, killing about 2,000 soldiers and over 1,500 civilians, including women and children who drowned trying to escape in boats. The name Cromwell became synonymous with the devil for the Irish, a curse that lives on in their historical memory to this day. His 9-month campaign in Ireland was brutally effective. He broke the organized resistance, but the cost was terrible. The military actions were followed by the confiscation of Catholic-owned land and their forced resettlement to the barren province of Connaught in the west. Was the slogan of this policy. Ireland was devastated. By various estimates, up to 40% of the island's population perished as a result of the war, famine, and disease it caused. For Cromwell, It was a victory of faith and civilization over barbarism and idolatry. For Ireland, it became a national catastrophe, with wounds that have not healed to this day. He had barely finished the pacification of Ireland when he was urgently recalled to England. A new threat had emerged from the north. The young Charles II had struck a deal with the Scottish Presbyterians. He agreed to adopt their faith in exchange for a crown and an army. Scotland, which had been an ally of the English Parliament just yesterday, was now its enemy. The commander-in-chief of the new model army, Sir Thomas Fairfax, already horrified by the king's execution, refused to lead an army against his former Scottish allies and resigned. There was no longer any doubt as to who was the sole and indispensable leader. In June 1650, Oliver Cromwell was appointed Lord General, Commander-in-Chief of all the armed forces of the Commonwealth. He immediately invaded Scotland, but here he faced a very different kind of opponent. The Scottish army, led by the experienced General David Leslie, was disciplined and fanatical. Leslie, knowing he could not defeat Cromwell in open battle, employed a scorched earth policy. He retreated, luring the English army deeper into the country while destroying supplies. Cromwell's army, suffering from hunger and disease, found itself trapped near the town of Dunbar, pinned against the sea by a Scottish force twice its size. The situation seemed hopeless. On the night before the battle, September 3, 1650, a date Cromwell considered his lucky day, he prayed, seeking a sign from God. And, as he himself believed, he received one. The Scots, confident of victory and pressured by their preachers who demanded the immediate destruction of the army of sectaries, made a fatal error. They descended from their advantageous positions on the hills to the coastal plain to prepare for a morning attack. Cromwell, observing this maneuver, exclaimed, "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands." At dawn, in a driving rain, he launched a sudden, devastating attack. His army, which the Scots believed to be demoralized and broken, moved as a single unit, attacking the unprepared enemy. The Battle of Dunbar became a classic of military art. The Scottish army was completely annihilated, 3,000 killed, 10,000 taken prisoner. Cromwell lost fewer than 30 men. It was not just a victory, it was a miracle, which Cromwell and his soldiers took as direct proof of God's approval of their cause. But the war was not over. Exactly 1 year later, on September 3, 1651, Charles II and the remnants of the Scottish army made a desperate gamble. They invaded England, hoping to raise a royalist rebellion. Cromwell caught them near the city of Worcester. This was his last great battle. He himself called it the royalist army was utterly defeated. Charles II miraculously escaped, hiding for weeks, according to legend, in an oak tree before finally fleeing to France. The war was over. All enemies of the Commonwealth in England, Ireland, and Scotland had been crushed. 3 kingdoms lay at the feet of Oliver Cromwell. He was at the zenith of his power, the undisputed military leader, the savior of the Republic, a man who seemed to be led by the hand of God himself. But upon returning to London, he faced an enemy far harder to defeat than any army: politicians. He had won the war. Now he had to win the peace. And that battle would prove to be far more difficult and agonizing for him. Returning to London in the autumn of 1651, after his final victory at Worcester, Cromwell was greeted like a Roman conqueror. He was the savior, the man who had crushed all enemies of the Republic. But instead of reveling in glory, he sank into a state of deep anxiety and frustration. As a soldier, he had done his job. He had brought peace. Now he expected the politicians, the very parliament for which he had shed blood, to finally begin building a new, godly world. He awaited reforms. He expected the creation of a new, just legal system, the reform of the church, and laws that would promote but nothing happened. He faced the same problem as many revolutionaries after him. It is far easier to destroy an old world than to build a new one. The pathetic remnant of the Long Parliament, which went down in history as proved completely incapable of constructive action. These 60 or 70 members, who owed their power entirely to the army, clung to it with a death grip. They had become a corrupt, self-satisfied oligarchy. Instead of enacting reforms, they were busy dividing up confiscated royalist lands, appointing their relatives to lucrative positions, and delaying any legislation that might threaten their power. They refused to hold new elections because they knew they would not be re-elected. They wanted to rule forever. For Cromwell, this was not just political sabotage, it was a betrayal of God's cause itself. The man who believed he was fighting to establish a kingdom of saints on earth watched as his victory turned into the rule of a clique of self-serving lawyers and merchants. He tried persuasion. For nearly 2 years, he engaged in endless, exhausting negotiations with them. He attended their sessions, pleaded, demanded, and threatened. "I told them," he later recalled, "that the nation looked for justice, but they would not hear." His patience, never his strong suit, was running out. The army grumbled. The soldiers and officers, especially the radical Puritans, saw the rump as no less an evil than the king. They demanded decisive action from their Lord General. Tensions mounted. The final straw was a bill that Parliament tried to pass in secret from Cromwell. This law provided not for dissolution and new elections, but for self-perpetuation. Current members would remain for life and would themselves have the right to approve or reject new members. This was an outrageous usurpation of power. On April 20, 1653, upon learning of this attempt, Cromwell flew into a rage. It was the same Old Testament fury of a righteous man that he had felt on the battlefield. Accompanied by a detachment of musketeers, he stormed into the Parliament building. At first, he sat down and listened to the debates in silence. But then his anger erupted. He stood up and began pacing the hall, unleashing a torrent of accusations against the members. His speech grew more and more furious. "I will put an end to your prating," he shouted. He took off his hat and began yelling insults at specific members. "One is a drunkard, another a whoremaster, a third a corrupt official." The members were struck dumb with terror. He then turned to the speaker and ordered him to leave his chair. He pointed at the mace, the sacred symbol of Parliament's authority, and said with contempt. Then he turned to his soldiers and gave the order. The musketeers, with muskets at the ready, began to push the members out of the chamber. Cromwell yelled after them. He personally locked the door to the chamber and put the key in his pocket. The Long Parliament, which had governed England for 13 years, started a revolution and executed a king, ceased to exist. It had been dispersed by a single man through the force of his anger and his soldiers. This was his personal Rubicon. Until this moment, he had always acted, at least formally, in the name of Parliament. Now he had destroyed that very source of legitimacy. Power in the country was in his hands. Absolute, unlimited military dictatorship. But Cromwell did not want to be a dictator. It contradicted his entire ideology. He sincerely believed that the quote 60, the quote 61 should rule. And so he decided to conduct the strangest political experiment in English history. After dissolving the rump, Cromwell and the Council of Officers decided to create a new governing body. But this was not to be an election in the usual sense. Cromwell despised democracy, believing that most people were sinners, incapable of making the right choice. He decided to assemble and quote 62 army officers, sent letters to independent Puritan congregations across the country, asking them to name the most pious, God-fearing men worthy of governing the state. From these names, the Council of Officers selected 140 men. It was a unique assembly, including gentry, merchants, and even a leather seller named Praise God Barebone, after whom this parliament was derisively nicknamed the quote 63 Cromwell. Opening the session of this new parliament, delivered a long, enthusiastic speech. He was convinced that a new era was dawning. He said he believed that these would finally build the godly England he had dreamed of. But the unearth quickly devolved into chaos. The bare-bones parliament turned out to be a collection of fanatics and radicals. They immediately began trying to implement their utopian ideas. They proposed abolishing the entire complex and convoluted English legal system and replacing it with a simple code based on the laws of Moses. They proposed abolishing church tithes, which undermined the financial foundation of the church. They attacked the universities, considering them hotbeds of pagan wisdom. Their radicalism frightened everyone: moderate Puritans, the army leadership, and, above all, Cromwell himself. He realized his experiment had failed. The saints were incapable of practical governance. 5 months later, in December 1653, the more moderate faction of this parliament, in collusion with army generals, staged a counter-revolution. They gathered early in the morning, voted to dissolve themselves, and handed all power back to Lord General Oliver Cromwell. The army leadership, tired of political experiments, decided to create a new, more stable form of government. They drafted the first and only written constitution in English history, the Instrument of Government. According to this document, England was declared a protectorate. Legislative power was vested in a parliament elected on the basis of a high property qualification. Executive power was given to a lifetime Lord Protector. On December 16, 1653, in Westminster Hall, a solemn ceremony was held. Oliver Cromwell, dressed in a simple black suit, took an oath and was proclaimed Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. The farmer from Huntingdon, who began as a humble MP, had become the sole, uncrowned ruler of 3 kingdoms. This marked the most contradictory period of his life. On one hand, his rule was an era of order, stability, and foreign policy triumphs. He reorganized finances, promoted trade, and created the world's most powerful navy, which successfully fought the Dutch and the Spanish. Admiral Blake won victories at sea, and Jamaica was captured. England, once a pariah after the king's execution, again became a leading European power. In domestic policy, he surprisingly pursued a policy of religious toleration, except for Catholics and Anglicans, even allowing Jews, who had been expelled 3.5 centuries earlier, to return to England. But on the other hand, his regime was a military dictatorship, propped up by the bayonets of the new model army. The parliaments he summoned proved to be just as rebellious as the ones he had dissolved. They challenged his authority and tried to curtail the army's powers. And Cromwell, losing patience, dissolved them one after another. After another royalist uprising, he resorted to extreme measures. He divided the entire country into 11 military districts, placing one of his major generals at the head of each. These were given virtually unlimited power. They not only suppressed dissent, but also tried to enforce Puritan morality by force. They closed theaters, banned horse racing, gambling, and cockfighting, and monitored morals in taverns. Merry England was plunged into gloom and fear. The rule of the major generals was so unpopular that even Cromwell himself was forced to abolish it. He was trapped. He sincerely did not want to be a tyrant. He wanted to rule with Parliament based on the law. But he could not relinquish his power because he feared that after he was gone, the country would descend back into chaos, and the cause of God for which he had fought would be lost. In 1657, a new parliament offered him a way out. They offered him the title of king. It was a temptation. The crown would have made his power traditional, legitimate, and hereditary. It would have returned England to a familiar form of government. The whole country, tired of the dictatorship of the quote, awaited this. But after long, agonizing hesitation, and under pressure from his old comrades in arms, the Republicans who declared they had not fought to replace one king with another, Cromwell refused. He said, he remained Lord Protector, but he did agree to make his office hereditary and to restore the House of Lords. The Revolution, which began as a struggle against absolutism, had, by a twist of fate, ended with the creation of a new monarchy, a new Cromwellian dynasty. He was a king in all but name, but the man who seemed indestructible was mortal. Years of war, endless work, and stress had undermined his iron constitution. In 1658, his favorite daughter, Elizabeth, died of cancer. This blow broke him. He fell into a deep depression and began to suffer from bouts of malaria. He felt the end was near. On September 3, 1658, the anniversary of his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester, during a terrible storm that seemed to tear trees up by their roots across England, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, died. The death of Oliver Cromwell left a deafening void. The great storm that raged over England on the day he died proved prophetic. The Colossus who had single-handedly supported the entire shaky structure of the Republic had fallen, and the building immediately began to crumble. His son, Richard Cromwell, who inherited the title of Lord Protector, was his complete opposite. He was a gentle, indecisive, good-natured country gentleman, utterly unsuited to governing a state, let alone commanding an army. The soldiers and generals who had obeyed his father as a living deity looked upon Richard with contempt. They nicknamed him the army which Cromwell had created and which he alone could control, immediately broke free of civilian authority. The generals, his former comrades, began to fight for power like a pack of wolves that had lost its leader. General Lambert, General Monk, General Fleetwood, each pulled in his own direction. They forced Richard to dissolve Parliament and then, a few months later, forced him to abdicate. The Protectorate, having lasted only a few months without its founder, collapsed. England was rapidly descending into anarchy. The country, exhausted by 2 decades of civil wars, religious fanaticism, and military dictatorship, yearned for only one thing: peace, order, and a return to old familiar traditions. And the sole symbol of that order was the exiled king. General George Monk, the cunning and pragmatic commander of the army in Scotland, understood this better than anyone. He marched on London, dispersed the squabbling generals, restored the expelled members of the Long Parliament, and initiated negotiations with Charles II, who was in Holland. In May 1660, to the ecstatic cheers of the crowd, Charles II returned to London. The restoration of the monarchy was complete. The Republic, for whose birth so much blood had been shed, died quietly and ingloriously, finding no one to defend it. It seemed as though England simply decided to erase those terrible 11 years from its history. But for the victorious royalists, this was not enough. They wanted revenge. And the main target of their vengeance was the man who could no longer answer them, Oliver Cromwell. The new Parliament, composed mainly of ardent royalists, passed, and most participants in the revolution were pardoned. But the main quad, those who had signed Charles I's death warrant, were to be tried and executed. 10 of them were hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the main culprits, Cromwell, his son-in-law Ireton, and Judge Bradshaw, who presided over the trial, were already dead. And so, a monstrous, unprecedented act of posthumous revenge was decided upon. On January 30th, 1661, the 12th anniversary of the execution of Charles I, the bodies of Cromwell, Ireton, and Bradshaw were exhumed from their tombs in Westminster Abbey, where they had been buried with royal honors. The decaying corpses in their shrouds were taken to Tyburn, the main site of public executions. There they were hanged on the gallows and left on public display until sunset. In the evening, the bodies were taken down, and the executioner cut off their heads. The headless corpses were thrown into a common pit for criminals, and the head of Oliver Cromwell was impaled on a 6-meter pole and mounted on the roof of Westminster Hall, the very building where he had once tried a king and been proclaimed Lord Protector. It was meant to serve as a perpetual reminder to all of the fate of traitors and tyrants. This gruesome trophy remained there for nearly a quarter of a century, outlasting the reign of Charles II and his brother James II, until one day during a storm, the pole broke and the head fell to the ground. After that, it began its strange, macabre journey, passing from one collector to another, until finally, in 1960, 300 years after the restoration, it was secretly and quietly buried on the grounds of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, where the young Cromwell had once studied. Thus ended the earthly and posthumous odyssey of this man. But who was he really? Was he a humble farmer who, like the biblical Gideon, was called by God to save his people from tyranny, and who accepted power only out of cruel necessity? Yes, he undoubtedly and sincerely believed this himself. To the last day of his life, he did not consider himself a usurper. He saw himself only as an instrument in the hands of Providence, a humble vessel chosen for a great mission. He sought neither wealth nor luxury, lived modestly, and to the end remained at heart that same stern Puritan gentleman from the provinces. But was he also a religious fanatic, whose unshakable belief in his own chosenness allowed him to justify any and all deeds, no matter how brutal? Was he a cruel dictator who, after dissolving Parliament, executing the king, and drowning Ireland in blood, established a military regime in England far more absolute than the one he had fought against? Yes, this too is an undeniable truth. Oliver Cromwell is a tragic figure. woven from irreconcilable contradictions. He was a champion of Parliament's liberty, yet he dispersed it by force of arms. He was a champion of freedom of conscience, yet he banned theaters and entertainment, trying to impose his Puritan morality by force. He refused the crown, but ruled like a king, making his power hereditary. He was a military genius who never lost a battle, but proved to be an inept politician, unable to build a stable system that could outlive him. The revolution he led ultimately failed. The monarchy was restored. The Anglican Church regained its position. But nothing could ever be the same again. Cromwell and his revolution, for all their horror and failure, left an indelible mark on English history. They forever destroyed the idea of the champion. They showed that Parliament could not only argue with a king, but could also try and execute him. They laid the foundations, albeit through tyranny and blood, for future British parliamentarism. After them, no English monarch ever dared to rule without considering the will of Parliament. He was both a great creator and a great destroyer. He saved England from Stuart absolutism, but plunged it into the abyss of military dictatorship. He brought England glory on the international stage, but left behind a cursed memory in Ireland. He was a man of his cruel, fanatical age, and to judge him by the standards of our time is pointless. But his story is a timeless, frightening reminder of how easily the greatest idealism can turn into the greatest tyranny, and how a man convinced he is doing God's will can become a monster in the eyes of those he sought to save.